to discrimination in various forms and to deal with social problems. Certainly, fair share is a good idea, but again, fair share is not new. It really dates back to Justice Sutherland's opinion in the Euclid versus Amble Realty Company case, where he gave the court's imprimatur to zoning, but said there were times when the local interest is subsumed by the state interest. And this is just a classic example of this. But the other lesson in Mountain Laurel is that the kind of schemes where you talk about how many low-income people should go in each community is something which has not been replicated in any of the states. That's not been a success. Now, if one flies over a landscape at 30,000 feet, one sees it in a certain way. If one is on the ground, one sees things in a different way. If you're socioeconomically a high flyer, you see the folks below as a mass of people. If you're down there with the average person or the person who is below the middle of the economic totem pole, you see your neighbors in a much more varied, detailed, fine-grained way. And there's a lot of demoralization produced in many communities by government efforts, well-meaning efforts for the most part, to subsidize what are called the deserving poor. According to this Gertrude Himmelfarb, who's done a lot of writing in this area, for decision makers higher up the socioeconomic scale, distinctions among the underclass, the working poor, and the lower rungs of the middle class seem of little import. Likewise, the differences between those possible recipients of largesse who have multiple out-of-wedlock children, addictive behaviors, an inability to hold a job, and possible recipients with low incomes, but who make valiant attempts to adhere to middle-class norms, may seem to have lost their salience. Given such social institutions, it is difficult for those striving to improve their condition within what we deem substandard neighborhoods to feel that their achievements are respected or to persevere. Which is to say, why are people the most deserving? Is it simply because they have the least amount of money? Or is it most deserving to have a little more because one's really worked very hard for one's family and to keep one's life together? More generally speaking, Gertrude Himmelfarb has made the point that one of the reasons why the lower middle class and the middle class and the working class especially always have tried to stick to norms of proper behavior, whereas it was the aristocracy that was always dissolute, is because the aristocracy is rich. The aristocracy can usually buy their way out of the consequences of foolish behavior. And poor people knew they could not. They knew they had to discipline themselves or else they would go under. And now, of course, we see that being attacked on two ways. One is the kind of glorification in media of people who are rich and foolish. And the other, of course, is government support for making very foolish decisions. So these are things which in large ways contribute to the problem rather than to solve it. And housing, of course, is one of these things where individuals can not buy new housing, but buy existing housing. Often we see the fact that the average person will have trouble affording a new house. That's true in some places, although now, for painful reasons, it's less true than it was a few years ago. Many of us have never lived in a new house. I've never lived in a new house. There is a filtering process where if you make any additional housing, It may be that some people are going to latch onto that who are wealthier, but they're going to give up their existing places, and so housing inevitably goes down to benefit those who need it more. So those are some comments I have about affordable housing, and they really tie into a broader theme I wanted to raise. I wrote an article a few months ago that was in the Indiana Law Review called "The Really New Property." I don't know, have you read Charles Reich's The New Property? That was the classic article. It was a real bombshell published in 1973. For a while it was the most popular, most cited article ever published in the Yale Law Journal. And so it was a really, Reich's idea was that we should take government largesse and contracts and assistance to the poor and licenses and so on, and protect them by calling them property. And that, of course, was a very backhanded compliment to traditional property, because it understood that traditional property was a way of people having autonomy from the government and having their rights protected. William Pitt the Elder said that the King of England cannot enter a ruined tenement, which later John Adams translated to a man's home is his castle, which means that there's a place where you have autonomy from the government. So Reich wanted to expand this. And a couple of years ago, the Association of American Law Schools, which is our trade association, had a conference on transformative property. The notion was that if you were to redefine property, you could solve a lot of social ills. This was something I was a little skeptical about. So I wrote this article called The Really New Property, about these attempts to redefine law, to redefine society. Now, you remember that Sir Henry Maine famously said that the movement of progressive societies has been from status to contract. Status is when the Lord rides by on his horse and you're a peasant, you tug on your forelock and lower your eyes. Contract is where you have agreements, and where two people, even though one may have more money and one less, both have autonomy in the sense that it's protected by contract. And this is something, of course, that modern residential landlord-tenant law has departed from. But we do have this notion that people are equals, they do get along by means of contract, and yet we've seen lots and lots of departures from that. Why do we see these departures? Why are we always looking for transformative property? Harold Dempsey, who is an economist, and who you may have read in your property course about, he's the one who came up with this idea that people create property rights when it's worthwhile to do them. Because property is expensive, you have to monitor it and police it and keep track of it and so on. Dempsey had another idea, which I think is a much more general application, called the nirvana fallacy. The nirvana fallacy is the fallacy by which one takes an idealized version of something that you agree with, and you look at it and it's beautiful and it's fair and just, and you take this idealization and you compare it with the actual practical working of the opposing system that you disagree with. And of course, when you do that, you're going to find lots of flaws in the existing system, because it's, after all, a system run by people and people are fallible, but the new system, in its idealized glory, will not have any of those flaws. And we're just simply going to assume that it's going to work well in practice. And of course, it doesn't. So we see that a lot of attempts to change the nature of property and to provide more rights to groups doesn't work out well in practice as it does in theory. Another is the free lunch, the idea that you can get something for nothing. I'm always embarrassed at Federalist Society events to be talking about a free lunch but this is part of course, we're interviews, so that's our commercial. But the idea that people can get something for nothing And so we see on TV one group of people running for office says more government services, and another group says no, more lower taxes. Well, do you want more services or do you want lower taxes? And the people enthusiastically say yes, that's what we want. So the free lunch in operations, it's all going to work that way. Another fallacy: people could be different. If we had a different kind of society, people would relate differently to each other. And that, of course, was actually the reason why you had the Garden City movement, which talked about having lots of light and air. You had the Bauhaus School design. This is the genesis of those huge high-rise public housing towers. You get away from those little streets and little buildings on little streets where everybody's rubbing shoulders, and you have these big towers gleaming in park-like settings where no one feels really safe on those big grassy settings, and where little kids can't quite hold out to get upstairs to go to the bathroom and do it in the elevator. And you know, these things that sound so wonderful in theory don't work out in practice. And people really aren't different. Having different housing itself does not change human nature. And one problem, of course, is that if I had to identify a source of a lot of attention on student society, and this is something that was written about in a book called Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, the notion that some people see society, see people as being perfectible. If only we had the right social system, if only we had the right legal system, people would become more perfect. And as people are being ground down by bad systems, by bad laws. The other side of it is that people have their flaws. They are, as Isaiah Berlin paraphrased Immanuel Kant, people are crooked timber. And you can't build anything perfect out of crooked timber. We are inherently fallible people. So the Burkean approach, which is the basic conservative approach, really says, look, we are fallible people. What government can do basically is to set rules where most of us can get along tolerably well with each other most of the time. You can't change humanity to make us perfect. Now, subsidies for anything involve triangles of people. It involves government and people who want to do good. It involves the ostensible beneficiaries of doing good. And it involves a third group, those who are clear-eyed and want to do well. And so normally the way the triangle works is that those who want to do good say we must have a certain public service. Those who want to do well say, yes, we'll be happy to provide that for a price, and either the taxpayers pay or we charge it, and we give people something which is not what they may want the most. How do we deal with the problem with poor people in housing, for instance? Well, one way of looking at it is the problem is that people are poor. If people weren't poor, they certainly would understand that there is better housing and worse housing, and that they could, on their own, find decent housing if they had some money. Yet this notion of simply giving money to the poor, the negative income tax, which Milton Friedman wrote about a long time ago, never has caught on, both because it makes distribution very apparent, and we are a little squeamish about that because we understand intuitively that we really have trouble figuring out who might be deserving and who might not be deserving. And above all, there's no industry constituency pushing it. This morning on the way here, I was reading the current issue of the Journal of the American Bar Association, which has a long laudatory article about the ABA pushing for government payments for attorneys for low-income people in civil cases, not just criminal cases like Kennedy versus Wainwright, but civil cases. The American Bar Association thinks this is a great thing. And why not?